for you. The next question here is about Glenn Keely, and I didn't write the information down specifically of who it was, but they were asking about the Moho Mandan, and if I can elaborate on that a little bit more. And of course, that would be somewhat of a foreign topic for many. And this is just basically related to, there was a gentleman by the name of Glenn Keely, who's definitely risen into a greater state of consciousness. And he, I believe, was from Canada. I do remember he was from Canada. And he went in deep about stories about, different things that were taking place in Africa around the time where the patriarch was turned over, or the matriarch was turned over by the patriarch, but in this case, the patriarch with the capital P, which of course in this case would be the papacy, and also the Tsars that eventually went into Russia. Okay, so that's just a brief synopsis of what his information was about. But he kept mentioning that there was a priesthood that was a priestess. I guess you would call that, it's a coven. Okay, that's the word we're looking for. And he would mention that there was this coven of the Moho Mandan priestesses, and mainly the main priestess was the most responsible person for even creating what we're seeing in the United States right now, that it was actually a priestess. So he asked me, was there any more information about this anywhere in this question? And so my answer to that question is, you would lose the trail of the Moho Mandan priestesses at the name, because that name, while very accurate, is not a name that you will find cross-referenced anywhere on the internet, which, once again, I think in certain ways authenticated a lot of Glenn Keely's knowledge, because somehow he was coming up with this knowledge that it was accurate, and he would even have deeper names, but no one had found that information on the internet. So there was like no source. Okay. So obviously I digested the work, because I think personally, maybe I was one of the first people to really tap into his whole voluminous work. He has a couple videos on YouTube, but he was writing this stuff on a website, and his website looked somewhat like Dan Winter's website. It was just like text all over the place and everywhere, and you couldn't even really copy and paste the text and get it all in the right order. It was that wild. So it took some time to go through that. So I would highlight chunks of it and paste it into a document, and then put it all into a reader and just listen. And so I can summarize this then, since the question is directly about the Moho Mandan priestesses, I can summarize this as being Bath-Kol. Okay, so let's just, again, I have to answer the question. So let's just look here very briefly. Also, I will say that, if there's some kids in the room, I think this would be the time to where, this is where you will have to kind of like adjust the volume levels, just because the question is here. I have to answer the question, but it does get into adult stuff. Okay, so let's just go here very briefly. I'm not going to turn my screen capture on until you've done what you need to do on that side of things. And in the meantime, what I'm going to say is that, so what I do is a lot of people have this dualistic opinion about everything, and it's melting down humanity. And what I like to do now is come into a master level of awareness to where I can see the silver line on everything, and I can purify whatever was desecrated, because everything always starts as, let's say, this purified state, and then it starts working its way down from there. Okay, and we've already explained that. So let's look very briefly here, as we're making our transition, to Madame Blavatsky, who was, of course, very instrumental in bringing about the Theosophical Society, which we know later on became the OTO, or the Golden Dawn, which sits as the spiritual arm to Freemasonry today. We also know that Madame Blavatsky had as her, you could say, respective magicians, MacGregor Mathers, who wrote the Testament, or the Keys to Solomon, and also the Kabbalah Unveiled. And then also Aleister Crowley, whose reputation speaks for itself. Even deeper, we know that Eminem, or Marshall Mathers, is actually the grandson of the magician or high magician MacGregor Mathers. Okay, so we have a book by Madame Blavatsky, which she claims as her highest work, which is the Isis Unveiled. Geez, the brain is incredible, right? It's like, geez, like I could just, it takes a minute, but it's still there. So Isis Unveiled, right? Or the Isis Papers, excuse me. So Isis Papers or Isis Unveiled. No, Isis Papers, excuse me. Isis Papers belongs to somebody else. So it's Isis Unveiled, I believe it is. So she starts off writing the book and she mentions that the dedication to this entire work is to Bath-Kol. And because there was no reference to Bath-Kol also anywhere else on the internet, this created that same kind of phenomena with which is what Glenn Keely did. But fortunately enough, this name is able to be traced because it does actually break down in etymology to something specifically. But I just want you to understand that the introduction to Bath-Kol again into the world was done by, oh, actually here's a reference to the Code of the Matrix, and I mentioned it in there. There's a full circle. So what's here is that it's just that you have to know that the Moho Mandan priestesses that Glenn Keely is talking about is under the Coven of Bath-Kol. All right. So this is all secretive stuff because remember in the forest, basically, as I call it, so when you have children, you take your children to the hospital to have them, and then they identify those children and they get certification, they get papers and everything. But in covens, children are born, and those children are the law, the system, the state, the country never knows those children were born because they never leave the coven. So it's standard to us to think that everybody goes to the hospital to birth, but we even have probably some that have had home births and are still like wondering if they should put this baby in the system. It becomes a much more difficult life for sure, just, ducking around all of what goes on. But there are many people who don't have their children in the system. So let's just imagine in certain countries, though, it's even less overwatch on this kind of thing. So we have lots of kids being born that they're not necessarily registered in the system, or there's no awareness that those children are born. Okay. So in the covens of Bath-Kol, that's really where they're calling from. I guess that would be the term. That's where they would raise more coven priestesses. Okay. So now, as we're aware of that, if you wanted to get this today, like in I don't know when the movie came out, but in the speak of how people communicate today through movies, you would actually find this coven of Bath-Kol. And they don't mention the names, but when you know what you're looking at, you know what they're talking about, right? Because there's always an initiation going on. And it turns out that Vin Diesel's initiation happened to play out. And let me just a second here. Okay, I think my thing may have froze for a minute. So Vin Diesel's initiation happened to play out inside of a movie known as Babylon AD. Okay, so this automatically explains, again, in entering Babylon, we're talking about Sumerian stuff, which at the end of the day, when we look at the OTO and what they call the Cthulhu or Cthulhu, and they worship these elder gods, etc., some of them being vampire squid, etc., and this is their whole theo or mythos in which they got from Lovecraft, right? Which was actually all of Lovecraft's work, which was admitted later, especially by Paschal Bishop Randolph. Bishop Randolph was basically Lovecraftian works were racist works. It was kind of like the same thing that Albert Pike got into. And we realized why that would all play out, because underneath everything, there's this war going on with the Nagas, right? So in this respect, just to stay focused on this, Vin Diesel's initiation takes place in this movie called Babylon AD, in which his responsibility is to take this woman from a coven where she's never seen any part of the world, and from these old women to another coven inside the United States. And he needs to protect her through that process because they are setting out to kill her for, numerous amount of reasons. Okay. So if we just rewind here, we see that, or look closely here, we see that Vin Diesel has on his neck the seal of the Necromicon, or the seal of Marduk, which is several imperfect pentagrams. And then we find other symbolism within the movie showing that, again, the ritual is actually being done and taking place. So that's just the modern reference to, okay, can I back this up anywhere to see somewhere else maybe that there is in fact this coven, and so that's what they're showing in the movie. So now we would only then need to go to the metaphysical data set to find the rest of the story. So that way we're not leaning upon our own understanding, but the understanding of the scholars that have deciphered the work. Okay, so let's bring this in our own fashion, but in conclusion, this is saying the Allied, well, we're going to start here. I'll fast forward that because it's a little X-rated, but it's saying it's basically necrosexual magic. And we talked about this before, that Seth had this thing going on with women and magic and sexual magic, and that also made up the cult of Set. And because, or Set also Osiris, sometimes called Set Osiris. Also, we know that those Syrian mysteries are really what the OTO is bringing across. And then we know that has a lot to do with Orion. And then the whole thing just kind of cascades from there as being, definitely not something that every time we see someone going in, that they come out unscathed. So we're only saying, we cannot say exactly what's going on in there, because I would think it would be a horror to practice something that others come out quite distorted. So we know that inside of these secret societies that are involved in Freemasonry, that this is the kind of magic that they practice. So let's verify that. Okay. Now, does this bear exact resemblance to what the original was? No, because the original of anything is sitting in a pure state. Once it becomes corrupted, it's now inverted. So then, if we know that, we can also see what the pure state is. We would basically be able to understand the true daughters and what their purpose was. But we would, unfortunately, these days have to look at it through the corruption of the priestess craft. Okay? So we have here, it's a mention that necrosexual magic. Isis is depicted as restoring Osiris's penis. The imagery is probably Coptic and works as a pun on the sarcophagus, a Greek sarphagus, which means flesh eating, connoting intercourse, linking thematically to death and then to rebirth. Okay, so this is the corruption. The core virgin priestess is an intermediary sanctioned genetically through her menstrual blood, the fire star. The onset of the oracle's period is referred to as Bath-Kol, the daughter of the voice, attributed to the virgin's call. The first traces of this pubescent blood, in Latin, the macula, literally the spot, refers to a masca, a type of witch. Her menstruation blood, the macula, is cultic of the red serum and describes the immaculate conception. So from here, we now need to wean out the corruption from the purified. So the corruption obviously is, yes, that what we see now that is predominantly being used, especially in the arts of the OTO, and what even Aleister Crowley brought forth himself, was a dark tantra that involved and fed into things like what was mentioned with the Grail Queens and the Grail Kings, which is the Magdalena, or the initiations of Magdalena, or Mag in this case being menstrual fluid, which also in this case means that menstrual fluid is magnetic. More importantly, what it's saying is that there's a macula, or literally a pubescent menstrual fluid that contains some type of initiatory energy called the fire star. And so if we're imagining this in an environment where women are in a sanctum, kind of like the Amazons, then you can kind of see how women would be brought through a process of an awareness of themselves through that first menstruation cycle, which still remotely takes place today with women in their with the mother and her daughter, where she has to now explain to her what this is all about. But if you can imagine on a much deeper level, it's a lot more deeper with when you're now finally able to bring life. Now, the corrupted side of this is that because this specific cult that we're referring to with OTO are fascinated with death and the energy of death, they celebrate the menstrual cycle as an actual barren time. So according to the theism, that when the woman is in her cycle, in the period of her cycle, she's not capable of being impregnated. And the actual menstrual fluid itself is the aborted fetus or the egg, right? So in this case, they are worshiping that aspect of it and removing the sacred aspects of this transition point where the woman now goes into the level of being able to sustain and support life. So then, because if we look into these ancient texts, which I don't have in front of me, but I was reading the other day, and it was just a prayer to the ancient mother inside of Egypt. And they were just saying in a nutshell that this ability to bring life into a world is really, really difficult. It is a very, very, very high level of power. And they kind of recognized already that their power was not on the same level as that at all. So they always gave reverence to this ancient mother because she can bring beings through portals. And we've talked about this before, that we see these external structures in many ways as external portals. You know, if you build a pyramid and then you bring souls through it, it's almost like, well, a woman can bring a soul through. Why would you use a building versus a woman? So again, that would be schisms in the priesthood, to be honest. This is why you get a lot of, as it keeps continue to mention, and let's keep reading it, the monthly cycle of the priestess alludes to the mammal in conjunction with the red goat. The whole thing with goats, I think that at this point, because we've had so much of this symbolism of this demonic goat thing, we don't really see how it, for middle class, we can say the middle class ancients, the goat in itself was the way, it's like how you survived. See, managing cows in larger mammals is difficult. So even the lamb and the goat are virtually synonymous with each other. They're very similar. But you'll notice that it's weird because when you even see the difference between the Arab and the Israelis, it's like the difference between a lamb and a goat, even genetically. And, you know, maybe we'll save that story for later. But there definitely seems to be a part of history where the copulation or the energetic mixing with certain animals that are on the planet seem to actually create certain tribes. And we've talked about that before. It may seem, uncomfortable now, but we've gone into it deeper. So what this is mentioning is clearly this is like from that bloodline. It is this bloodline specifically that is practicing these rituals. So it goes on and says, a practitioner of the night then. So we know that Madame Blavatsky was talking about Bath-Kol, and we know that she was talking about basically a witch or a practitioner of the night. We know that these practitioners have an awareness of sex magic, and this sex magic also involves virgin priestesses, like we see on Conan, which is CNN. We see Conan, the Conan #1, where he's trying to get this priestess to this other area. Now that's the same thing that's playing out in Babylon AD with Vin Diesel's. He's trying to get this priestess who's pure to another level or to another area, right? So again, Conan #1, if you watch that again, or the one with James Earl Jones, that also lays out this same thing. Except for Conan and James Earl Jones in real life are really on the same side. So as it goes on, it says, then Bath-Kol is the bride of Saturn or Satan, dressed in black. She is presented as a sorceress and a prostitute to the Dark Lord. Her offerings are conducted inside the inner sanctum and the temple in alignment to the resurrection of the serum. Historically, the stained skin of the goat is hung in a Jewish tabernacle. Later, the temple sanctuary. Right. So again, this rite, as we're seeing, is still being practiced within this culture, but it has lost all of its purity. And then now it is now brought up the energy. And this is why we see this in the world now. And that's the energy of more of the priestess or the goddess being used from a prostitution level versus as the creative component and power that is free. Right. So then it goes forward because this is still a coven. And as was mentioned by Pierre Sabak, that Saturn, and as I talked about before, Saturn is more of like a Mrs. Doubtfire. He mentions that Saturn is more of like what we would say today in modern terms is more like a dyke. So it's more of like a very strong masculinated female energy. And then that strong masculated female energy is the head of the coven. So it's important to be very clear about this, because it technically inside the coven, no males are allowed unless they become eunuchs, which is the priestcraft of Osiris. The symbolism is Osiris is missing his generative component. He has no penis. So it's the same thing that you will find in the ancient setting, where anyone that was to be around inside of the harem, that was a servant inside of the harem, that was a male, had to be an eunuch or castrated to make sure that this eunuch never slept with any other women and actually produced offspring with the women, okay? So the only males then that are allowed inside the priestcraft of Satan, believe it or not, because we're seeing all these males at times in the whole Satan thing that the U.S. is doing, but Satanism is actually more of a matriarchal thing. So behind it, or veiled, which is what you see in Islam, the feminine force is veiled. So that's why the book of Madame Blavatsky is Isis Unveiled, right? To take the veil off of this mystery of what is going on. So finally, it mentions masquerading as an eunuch. The serum is clothed in human form, cryptically a red goat skin. Now, this is loaded because it's basically saying that. So now there's a kind of another energy that's moving around that is kind of inside of the female coven, pretending as if it's an eunuch or that it cannot produce offspring, but it can. And then it goes on, it says this is duplicated as the Aryan priest. The hide of the goat is a motif of transfiguration, the mammalian ministration. So what this is saying also cryptically is that, that's what I'm saying, you can't take this stuff for face value. Cryptically, what it's saying is, so you think that these priests, the popes, etc., are the heads of the priesthood, the Aryan priesthood, you can say, which is what the OTO was all about, the Great White Lodge. But really, behind that is really the coven of Bath-Kol. Okay, so that is, in conclusion, the Moho Mandan priestess, if you may, as a terminology, and their work that they are continuously doing to shape as much as possible the future of humanity through institutions such as, one, Planned Parenthood, which is owned by George Bush's father, and the ethics that have come through Planned Parenthood and the fetuses that they achieve from when they get them from women who are aborting their fetuses. So all those fetuses are taken and different things are done with those fetuses. Somebody was saying at minimum it's makeup. But on the other level, there's a massive thing that has been going on Earth with that level of energetics and this pure energy, and it has been corrupted completely, and now it is in institutional hands, and that is a part of the culture and what they're doing now. Okay, so I think that was the most proficient to date explanation of what would be the Moho Mandan priestess and what would be the cult of Bath-Kol and what Madame Blavatsky, Kut Humi, Master Moria, and Saint Germain, and Melchizedek, and McGregor Mathers. And see, this is like the usual suspects to me. So all of their pictures are on a board and with string lining out one from the other. Jack Parsons, President Nixon, all of that network of darkness, which plays on the other side of the table of the master, but is master creator, and is blind to the overall process that we need to take this entire space through so that none of this that is distorted and unrefined ever happens again. It's a way of how we are preserving things, or need to learn, a way of how we're learning to truly preserve ourselves, right? Which is that protection.